Hi everyone, welcome to the January 26th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week it's the Pegasus World Cup recap edition of the Pacecast. We're going to look back at that stacked Gulfstream Park card from Saturday, where the feature was the Pegasus World Cup and the Pegasus World Cup turf. We'll talk about those two main attractions, but also all of the other stakes races on that card. There were 7 graded stakes in total. We'll go through a bunch of them. We'll also mention a couple of very impressive maiden winners, debut winners actually, from last weekend at Gulfstream, including one on Saturday that got a lot of people talking. Then we'll move on in the podcast, talk about some other venues, Oaklawn Park, where they ran their first Derby prep, the Smarty Jones last Friday, then Santa Anita, where they had a couple stakes last weekend, and finish things up with Aqueduct, where the venerable and likable Mr. Buff got back on track in the Jazzle Stakes. But as I said, the feature on this podcast is that Gulfstream Park card on Saturday, where they ran that Pegasus World Cup. And Craig, I think that's the logical place to start. Knicks Go, he was the big favorite coming in. I know both of us were hesitant to beat him. He looked just so good in this race. It really is not the toughest Pegasus World Cup that we've seen, and he seemed to tower over the field on speed figures, and he delivered once again.
Yeah, he was tough to go against for me. I know we talked about it on the forecast. He got bet down pretty heavy to 6-5, but he just kind of had the field over the barrel. He had the most early speed. He had by far the best speed figures. I know some people were questioning a mile and an eighth, but he had handled a mile and a 16th really easily. That Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile was much longer than a mile due to the long run up. So, I mean, I just didn't see it as worth taking a shot against him in here. And he proved he's just turned into a really new horse his last 3-4 starts, I guess it is. He's been blowing everybody out. This might have been his closest margin of victory in this race. I think he won by 3 maybe. But whatever, nobody's coming close to him. He's clearly tops of the handicap division, and I'll be excited to see where he goes next. I forgot the speed figure. He got a 133, which is the best he's run. He had a 131 in that Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, a 130 in his Keeneland allowance. So, I mean, he's clearly a top grade 1 horse and probably the best one we have out there now.
And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but how does that 133 compare to some other past Pegasus World Cups that we've seen? Because we've seen some pretty nice horses compete in this race, some very impressive winners, going back to Arrogate and Gunrunner. Do you know kind of where that fits in the pantheon, the small pantheon of Pegasus World Cup winners?
Yeah, I want to say it's right under, it's probably about third below the 2 horses that you mentioned, Arrogate and Gunrunner. I think both of those, I know Gunrunner cracked the 140 mark, which he did more than a few times in his career. Arrogate maybe was a 139. So it's a pretty big gap back to Knicks Go. Those two kind of tower over everybody else, but then I think he was higher than any others we've seen. Again, I'm just going from memory, so forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think like Accelerate maybe ran a 129, a 130. And yeah, I think this is third best.
Yeah, I mean, this horse is obviously just a different animal for Brad Cox for whatever reason. He had shown promise for Ben Colebrook early in his career, but he's just been a new rebirthed horse for Brad Cox. The 4 starts that he's made in this Bard have all been extremely impressive. As you said, this was, I think, his closest margin of victory, even though he won by just under 3 lengths. And I will say he worked out a perfect trip for him in this race, because Knicks Go is a horse that has a very high cruising speed, and Joel Rosario did not play around. He didn't try to raid him on the front end. He just let him set his comfortable fast pace and basically ran everybody else into the ground. I say fast, none of the speed figures are color-coded in red, but he was getting some pace figures in the mid-140s in the early portion of the race, and that's legitimate. And the other horses, nobody was really closing from the back, but I think that just speaks to the fact that this horse kept going up front. I do want to give an honorable mention to horses like Jesus's team and Independence Hall. I thought they both ran really well to be second and third here. Jesus's team just continues to pick up checks in these grade 1 races. He's just a game horse who always gives a hard try. And Independence Hall, who I thought was kind of ridiculous in this race, he finally got back to that potential that he showed as a 2-year-old when he won that Nashua so impressively. I don't know where that horse went for about 18 months, but it seems like maybe he's finally delivering on that early potential.
Yeah, the 2-3 finishers ran really well. They got 128 and 129 TimeformUS speed figures respectively, and both of those are grade one type efforts, and I wouldn't be surprised if Jesus's team is finally able to notch that grade one. And as you say, Independence Hall had run that huge race at Aqueduct as a 2-year-old, but we hadn't seen much from him, but he seemed to find that form. And I should mention, we were talking about Nick's Go, of course. I mean, he is a horse that showed a ton of promise as a juvenile, as I know you know. He was second in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. He won the Breeders' Futurity, I think it was. So sometimes I think people overlook that a bit. He did go off form for a while. He had a lot of tough trips in his 3-year-old season, a lot of hotly contested paces, but for whatever reason, he's found that form again. And, it's not just like it came out of nowhere, I guess is my point.
And there were some also rans in this race. Once we get back to the fourth place finisher, we're talking about runners that were beaten 9 and 10 lengths in here. There definitely were some no-shows in this race, as you're typically going to get in a race of this stature, with a large field going 9 furlongs, 12 horses at Gulfstream. Some horses were hurt by the post position or their trips at the back of the pack. Sleepy Eyes Todd, I thought, was surprisingly far back in the early going, and he couldn't really launch a rally. Code of Honor, he just kind of ran his typical race. He hasn't really gotten back to that top form that he had as a 3-year-old. We talked about that on the forecast last week. He's just not the runner that he once was. And Tax, once again, for the second time in this Pegasus World Cup, he just looked good coming in and didn't show up on the big race, so maybe that's not a big surprise with him. But that does kind of allow me to segue into a question about Lasix. This was one of many stakes races that's been run so far in 2020 where horses were forced to come off Lasix, as is the case on many top circuits now. All these stakes races being run in 2020, horses are not allowed to use Lasix. And I know we got a question on Twitter about this, about whether or not it factors into your speed figure making. I think I know the answer to that. But I think the bigger question also is, are we seeing horses perform up to expectations without Lasix?
Yeah, I think at this point I would say they are. I really haven't seen many issues. As far as making speed figures, I'm just doing it the same as normal for a few reasons. One, I think it would just be too much of a presumption to think horses aren't going to run as fast and to try to build that into the projections I make pre-race. I just think it would be a guessing game. I have data from years and years ago on the effect of Lasix, but who knows if it applies today? I certainly don't, so I'm not going to try to guess. And I'm personally going to wait until I have more data and see what the numbers tell me. I really need to look at days where we have stakes races where horses are running without Lasix, but at the same time, we have other races on the card at similar distances for horses with Lasix. And, I'd need a good set, probably I would say 30, 40 races like that to see if there's any kind of measurable effect. And it can be really tough because there's so many factors in races that can affect speed figures. It's really hard to narrow down to one thing. And that's why you need a pretty big sample size to do it.
Yeah, I actually had some free time on my hands yesterday, and I was interested in kind of getting a handle on this question. So I was looking through the Beyer speed figures. I didn't use the TimeformUS numbers to just kind of give us a neutral thing to talk about. But I was looking at the Beyer speed figures for all of the stakes races run so far in 2021 for 4-year-old and up horses at Aqueduct and Santa Anita, just as 2 examples of major circuits that aren't running with Lasix in their stakes races. And I just popped into a spreadsheet all the horses that ran what speed figures they ran in their stakes races in 2021, and I averaged their 3 speed figures coming into that race. So their 3 prior speed figures, and compared it to the figures that they ran without Lasix in these 2021 races. And the difference between their 3 race average coming in and the figure that they ran in this 2021 race without Lasix, the overall average of all these horses, from those that were eased to those that won, the difference was -1 Beyer point. And if I throw out the top 5 and the bottom 5, so horses that really just, were eased to the wire at Aqueduct or Santa Anita, horses that didn't handle the situation, or maybe the horses that bled, let's be generous and say that throughout the bottom 5 and throughout the top 5, then that average drop-off, it's just 0.4 Beyer points. So basically nothing at all. And if you look at the median, it's actually an increase. Horses going up by 0.6 Beyer points without Lasix. So, that's a small sample, and it's an imperfect metric to use because you're just basing it on 3 races coming in, and there are other factors at play, obviously. But I think it at least goes to show that we're not seeing the significant drop off that I think a lot of people were expecting to see without horses using Lasix. So it's worth monitoring moving forward. But I know that my hypothesis is that horses don't really need Lasix. I know that there were situations back in the early 90s where you did see horses improving with Lasix, but today's game is a very different animal. And I feel like we've seen a situation where bleeding is not that prevalent. And we saw all these 2-year-olds compete without Lasix last year, and now we're seeing a lot of horses come off Lasix. And I think we're going to see mounting evidence that horses just don't need Lasix to run their optimal efforts.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. And the one thing I would say, too, is back in the 90s when there was this mass move to where we are today, where about 95% of horses run on Lasix, it's very possible that Lasix could have been being used to mask things, which really isn't the case anymore with the testing. So, I mean, who knows? And that's why I'm very leery to use old data. And the other thing I would say with buyers or my speed figures or whoever you use, without knowing exactly what they're doing, it's hard to say. For example, if Andy Beyer had projected Knicks Go was going to run 110 Beyer speed figure, and the raw figure came up 120, he's going to say the track was 10 fast. If he decided to say, well, I think the horses are going to run a little slower and I'm going to project them at a 106, now the track's 14 fast. So we don't know what he's doing. So without having that knowledge, I'm a little leery to use. I know what I'm doing, so when I sit down with the data, I'll be able to look at it and say, this was how I did it, and, know what went into the numbers. So it's a little tough for me to talk about Beyer speed figures. When I get a chance, I'll ask him about it and see how he's handling it.
Yeah, and that variable that you mentioned, the projections coming in, those do influence what the speed figures ultimately are, both for you and Beyer, I know. So maybe that's something that's causing the speed figures to be a little higher or lower. You don't really know that until these horses continue to run back and they basically have a resume of form without Lasix, as all of the horses that are running in stakes races in 2021 are ultimately going to have. So that variable will disappear over time, but I think it just remains to be seen. It's still early.
Yeah, I do think there's some tracks that are going to allow Lasix as well. So it's going to be an interesting year for sure. We'll probably learn a lot, but it's not something that's going to have quick and easy answers.
Yeah, we got off on a bit of a tangent there, but I think it's an interesting topic and one that I know a lot of people have questions about. So I wanted to touch upon it a little bit. Let's move on to that other Pegasus race that was run on Saturday, the Pegasus Turf. Grade 1 event, going the mile and 3/16. And Colonel Liam, who was the favorite coming in, is a pretty exciting horse for Todd Pletcher as he wins this race by a neck. This was just the 4th turf start of his career, his 6th start overall, and he's ascended very quickly for the Pletcher barn. He's showed a lot of promise right from the start when he first got on turf at Saratoga last summer, and he's just continued to step forward. And I know this wasn't the fastest race in the world, but this horse still has some upward potential.
Yeah, I had mixed emotions about this one. I know we talked about it on the forecast, and we both talked about what an exciting horse he was, and he had the potential to be the star coming out of here. And he really didn't do anything wrong. Of course, he ran a great race. He won pretty easily. The pace wasn't super fast, but he was able to close from off of it. But I was expecting a bigger number personally. He wound up with a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, which is decent, but it's still quite a ways away from what we usually see from top turf horses. Now, I'll be the first to admit, with turf racing, horses like him who come from off the pace, they're kind of at the mercy of what happens in front of them, and final time's not always that important. So if he runs back and you ask me what do I think he's going to run, I think he's a horse who could easily run probably a 125, maybe even a 130 TimeformUS speed figure as we get toward the end of the year. But I did think this one would be a little faster, but as we're going to talk about some races later, there was an even faster turf race. So I'm still not completely sold that Colonel Liam's a superstar, but again, there wasn't anything to knock about the performance. I thought he was completely dominant in here.
And I do want to ask you how confident you are in these fractions on the turf that we saw at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. It visually, it seemed like this was a race that kind of fell apart towards the end as horses were really just flying to the finish from off the pace. The fractions tell a different story. The fractions looked a little slow. I know we've got the pace figure saying that it was just an even pace. So I'm a little skeptical of that. But regardless, just the visual impression that I got from Colonel Liam is kind of what you said, that he was held up early. I thought Irad Ortiz gave him a great ride. He was saving ground around both turns, and Irad did his typical thing where he somehow was able to get out into the clear at the top of the stretch. He did it cleanly this time. He just gradually pushed some other horses gently out of the way, but he got into the clear at the top of the stretch, and this horse really finished off the race well when he was asked to do so. It's not always the easiest thing to run by horses in the closing stages over the turf course at Gulfstream when it's firm, and he did so. The runner-up Largent, another Todd Fletcher horse, I thought he put in his typical game effort. He's now made 10 starts in his career and has never been out of the exacta. You have to like a horse like that. It seems like wherever Fletcher decides to run him, he always makes it close. He's never going to go off and win by a ton of lengths, but he seems to be right there regardless of the class of the race he's running in. So these are nice horses. I think it just remains to be seen if Colonel Liam has the potential to run some of those bigger turf speed figures that we saw from a horse like Brixton Mortar a couple of years ago, or if he's just more of an ordinary grade 1, grade 2 kind of horse.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. You ask about the fractions. I did time all these races, and anybody who's been following Gulfstream knows it's been a nightmare. Every day there's 2 or 3 races where the timing gets botched. And, I just do the best I can with it. And turf figures at Gulfstream are tough. Anybody that tells you they're not is probably lying to you, because they just run so many different course configurations, so many different rail settings and run-ups, even on the same day that, a lot of times you're just rating them one race at a time, and all you have to go with is the field that you're looking at and how they performed as a group and try to break it down. So in those cases, it is kind of hard for a horse to have a breakout figure, and unless they just win the race by a lot of lengths, which Colonel Liam obviously didn't do here. So, that does tend to hold speed figures back. It'd be a lot easier if when they ran their 7 turf races, at least 4 were on similar setups, but we just never get that at Gulfstream. So all you can do is the best that you can. Hopefully it'll get better someday where we'll actually know what the real run-up is of these races and they time them correctly, but we're not there yet, so we just do what we can.
And I think we had some similar questions about the fractions in the race right before the Pegasus turf in the WL McKnight grade 3 event going 1.5 miles on the turf course. I know we don't have fractions in here, or at least pace figures in here for the winner or the rest of the field. Tie to the Sea. Obviously, visually, it seemed like he was setting a pretty moderate pace up front. There was really not much speed signed on coming in. I know some of us thought that maybe they'd ride Doswell aggressively. They chose not to do that, but Tyler Gaffalione came out of the gate with a plan. He sent Tie to the Sea to the front and took over pretty decisively in the opening stages, wasn't afraid to open up a couple lengths on the field, and you could see the entire way this horse just loved being out there by himself on the front end, and another Mike Maker horse came to challenge him in the lane, but Tie to the Sea turned him away.
Yeah, this was a big effort from him. He got a 1:23 TimeformUS speed figure. Just a note on the pace figures, we don't have them because for some reason at Gulfstream, they don't publish 1.25 mile time for these 1.5 mile races. It's something I'm working on behind the scenes and have been for quite some time because, it's a turf race. What's more important than knowing what the closing fraction is? I would argue it's probably the most important part of the race as far as figure making, but until we get them, there's not a whole lot I can do. So all we can do is look at the early fractions and the final time. And I still think, he ran a big race. I don't think there's anything phony about the number. He was very game. He got challenged by his stablemate Temple. He may even been ahead behind at one point. It was pretty close, but he fought back and was able to pull away. So just another big effort and another win at 1.5 miles for a Mike Maker horse.
Yeah, this horse has that typical pattern of a Mike Maker runner that as soon as they started stretching him out in distance, he just took his game to another level and did so again here. He's an exciting horse. I think he's 5 years old now. I believe he was 4 last year when he started winning those allowance races. So we'll see if he still has some upward momentum, but he certainly ran a legitimate speed figure for this grade 3 race in here. Moving on to some other graded stakes events from that Saturday card. Let's go over to the dirt course, where early in the day, they ran the Fred Hooper, going that one-turn mile. Performer was the big favorite in here. I know a lot of people expected him to get back on track and assert himself as potentially a player in the handicap division this year. I'm not sure that he quite did that, as he gutted out this victory by just a neck over a game eye of the Jedi. What did you make of this race?
At first I was not impressed at all. I thought it was just kind of an ugly effort. He was 4-5, and on paper, I thought he probably should have been 2-5 if the performer we expected showed up. But the more I looked at it, this was another race where the timing was botched. Nothing ever popped up on the screen. Everything's hand time. So I did it myself from video. So I'm pretty confident in the fractions and the final time that I came up with, and it kind of gave a new perspective on things. He wound up with a 1:14 TimeformUS speed figure, final time of 1:16, but it was a race that was really slow early. We have the opening quarter and half mile coded in blue. They were double-digit figures, not even 100 for a race that finished in a 1:16. And he did look to be in some traffic. He was kind of in tight, something we hadn't really seen before. So, I don't want to totally write it off and say it was a bad effort, but I'll be honest, at this point, I'm starting to think maybe it was the Discovery that was the fluke, and maybe he's just really kind of a grade 3 type horse.
I don't know if you know off the top of your head what the fractions were in this race. What was the hand time that's posted in Equibase? Is that close to correct? 23-4 or 47-1?
They were fairly close. I had it a little slower early and late, so not a whole lot that I was going to complain and say it should be changed or anything, but it definitely made a difference in the early fractions. Equibase had it a little bit faster than me. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but yeah, it definitely wasn't one where I totally agreed with them.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I agree with you, that is a pretty slow pace for a one-turn mile at Gulfstream. And I still was a little disappointed in Performer. You know that I've been a big fan of this horse all along, and he hasn't really stepped forward in the way that I would have wanted. Once again in this race, breaking from the inside like he did in the Cigar Mile, he was just a little sluggish early. I thought he had more tactical speed than he showed here and last time in the Cigar Mile, and it just wasn't really on display as he rated in behind this slow pace. And maybe more distance is what he wants. He certainly showed a ton of stamina in the Discovery, and that was the best effort of his career. Like you, I've got some doubts about how good that really was in retrospect, but it seems like Shug has been kind of intent on running in one turn since then, and I don't know. I'd like to see him go 2 turns again, but we'll see. Shug certainly seems to know best with these horses most of the time, so we'll see where they decide to go with him in the future.
Yeah, and I did want to point out his one big effort, that one in the Discovery, did come over one of those really slow Aqueduct winter tracks. So it's possible maybe that's just, maybe he just really liked that surface and kind of flattered what he really is as a horse. We'll see. I'm sure he's going to show up in a tougher spot next time. And like you, I just don't think either one of us were all that impressed. So should be interesting.
Another one-turn dirt race that was run. Stakes event on this Saturday card at Gulfstream was the Grade 2 Inside Information, going 7 furlongs for the fillies and mares. And we saw something that we hadn't seen in a very long time, and that's Pacific Gale in the winner's circle. This mare has picked up a lot of checks over the years. Not really one that likes to cross the wire first, especially in stakes races. But she got the job done here. I think it was her first victory since October of 2018.
Yeah, it had been quite a while. I think it was 17 starts maybe since she'd won a race. And, I couldn't have come up with this when she beat the 2 horses we picked on the forecast who ran second and third. I don't think she's ever won a stakes race before, if memory serves. She'd come close a few times, but never seemed to be able to close the deal. So as a handicapper, I have no idea where this effort came from, but it was good enough to win. We talked about it wasn't a strong field at all on paper. Cinnabunny went off, I think, the favorite again. Maybe it was This Is My Time. It was one of the two, but neither one of them had really what I'd call overwhelming speed figures coming in for a race, Grade 2 race of fillies and mares, and Pacific Gale was the one that stepped up. But overall, I think it was a pretty weak race, and I'm not sure I want anybody coming out of here.
Yeah, I don't disagree. When a horse like Pacific Gale is winning by open lengths, I think you know that there were some no-shows in behind her. I agree. I don't know where it came from based on her recent form, but I should point out, I mean, she was a pretty good horse back in 2019. Even though she wasn't winning stakes races, she was earning some pretty big speed figures when she was running behind Come Dancing, or even when she got away from that one at Belmont after that, in races like I want to say the Vagrancy. I think she nearly won that. So she had been good at prior points in her career, just hadn't shown that form in a long time. And she got back to it here.
Yeah, I should admit I was wrong. She did win a stakes race, third start of her career. She won the sorority at Monmouth as a 2-year-old, but long time between drinks for this one.
Moving back to the turf horse and stretching back out in distance, they ran the Grade 3 La Prevoyante for the older fillies and mares, going 1.5 miles. And I think we saw another breakout performance here from Todd Pletcher's Always Shopping. Since they've gotten this filly out to longer distances on the turf, she's just turned into a different animal. She was impressive winning that Via Borghese last time, and perhaps even more impressive here as she drew away from this field late.
Yeah, I was impressed. Showed she was able to handle the 1.5 mile distance. I mean, she had run well at the distance before, but she looked even better this time. She got a 1:16 Timeform US speed figure. Kind of showed that 1:19 last time out wasn't a fluke. What I thought was interesting with her, I think it was the owner I saw being interviewed, and all he was talking about was the blinkers and how it's made such a difference. And I don't doubt that the blinkers have made a difference, but to me, it's clearly the surface change which has made the biggest difference. I mean, she just looks like a completely different horse on turf. She was okay on dirt, but on turf, she's always been better. Even when she was mostly campaigning on dirt, she had tried the turf once at Gulfstream in a small stakes race and ran a much better speed figure than she had ever run on dirt. And then they put her back on dirt for a couple times. So I'm not sure what the thinking was there, but I think they finally figured it out. And I doubt we'll be seeing her on anything but the green stuff anytime soon.
Yeah, we agree about that. She's definitely moved up with the surface change, and I think it remains to be seen if she can continue ascending in this division, because while she was visually impressive in this race, the speed figure is just okay for this level, a 1:16 for a Grade 3 event. I think that really speaks to the fact that maybe a lot of horses behind her didn't want to go this distance, and it just wasn't the strongest field overall. So I think it remains to be seen if she can win some of these tougher races in this division in New York later in the year. But certainly for now, with the winner at Gulfstream, she's really thriving. Final stakes race from that Saturday card that we'll discuss was the Grade 3 Marshuas River, also on the turf for the fillies and mares, and we saw the returning Zofel got the job done for Brendan Walsh. She did it from well off the pace, came with her usual strong late kick to get the job done over Sweet By and By.
Yeah, it was a good effort. Zofel got a 1:16, the same as Always Shopping. She ran well off a layoff, as she usually does. So this is one I'd be a little leery of going forward, because she does seem to fire off the bench, and then her form kind of gradually tails off. So I'm not going to get too excited about her until she lays off and comes back again. Not that she's going to fall apart next race. I mean, she usually hangs in there for a few races and runs pretty well, but you know, as you mentioned with Always Shopping, a 1:16's not all that much to get excited about for older fillies and mares in a Grade 3. I mean, it's decent, but nothing to expect her to rise up the class ladder.
And I will say, within the context of this race, I thought the runner-up Sweet By and By ran quite well, because this was a race that featured 3 horses sort of battling it out on the front end, along with Vigilante's Way and Our Baby Ruth, and Sweet By and By was 3 wide against those horses, took over at the top of the stretch, and just got run down by Zofel, who might be a better horse anyway, but I thought Sweet By and By ran pretty well to be second here, as others were just kind of picking up pieces behind her. But we'll see. I mean, I don't think any of these horses are going to be going on to win a Grade 1 anytime soon, because like you said, the speed figure just it's not really that high for this level. Before we move away from this Saturday card at Gulfstream, there's one more race that we do have to talk about. That was the 6th race on the card for the 3-year-olds. Maiden special weight going 7 furlongs, and the winner of this race, Godolphin first-time starter for Brendan Walsh named Prevalence, turned a lot of heads. This horse showed some speed early on, got away from the field on the turn, and won off very impressively under a hand ride. I don't think the speed figure came back quite as fast as some were expecting. This certainly was not a hidden scroll kind of number, even though this horse brought back some memories of hidden scroll as he drew away from the field in the lane of this race. But still, it was a nice performance in a debut effort for this horse.
Well, I have to say before I get to this race, I was surprised you didn't put Hidden Scroll on our rundown, just because I know what a big fan you are. So I'm proud of you that you were able to get him in here somehow.
I'm making progress.
But yeah, Prevalence, I was surprised when I watched the race, as most people did. I thought it was going to be a big speed figure, but he got a 102. It's good. It's not great for a 3-year-old this time of year. Obviously, it's just his first start, and I would expect him to do more, moving forward. And I'll leave it to you to talk about his breeding. To me, it looked like a little more turf breeding, but distance, he should be able to probably go longer, but I'm just not sure what to make of him, because I was expecting a 110 plus kind of speed figure when you win a race by 8.5 lengths, but he was in against mostly a bunch of other first-time starters, and it's always possible he just didn't run into the strongest field, and that kind of made the margin look better than he was.
Well, there's always going to be that inevitable chorus of people that will say, oh, well, he could have run so much faster because he was geared down late. I rarely buy into that argument. I'm not going to do so with this horse because, I mean, you can just watch the replay. He was running to the wire. I mean, even though Tyler Gaffalione dropped his hands, I mean, this horse was really running through to the finish as others were kind of dropping away behind him. So I don't know that he actually could have run that much faster if he had been Gaffalione had been whipping and driving him to the finish line. As for the breeding, he's by Medaglia d'Oro. The dam is by Gosatper. She's actually a full sister to Better Lucky, who was a good horse for Godolphin about a decade ago. She was one that was equally proficient going about a mile on turf as she was sprinting on dirt and synth. She was just a remarkably versatile horse. This dam's also a full sister to Final Frontier, who was a good turf sprinter for those same connections. So will this horse ultimately handle classic distances? I think it's kind of up in the air. He has a little bit more of a miler's pedigree, but he certainly looked good winning this race, and obviously was not pressured to get the job done. So we'll see where he goes from here. He'd have to come along pretty quickly to make the Derby, to make the Kentucky Derby if they're going down that route. But this was obviously the right place to start. And I do want to say, I think there's another horse you want to follow out of this race, and potentially there's a horse that you might want even more than Prevalence, and that's the third place finisher Ghazali for Todd Pletcher. This horse was up with the leaders early, seemed to get very green midway down the backstretch as he was reacting badly to kickback. He just looked like he didn't know what he was doing, and he actually dropped all the way back to last place at the 3/8 of a mile pole. And then once Luis Saez got into him, he actually re-rallied in the stretch and got back up into third, almost finished second here after dropping back to last on the turn. Just a very eventful run for this horse. And I know there wasn't a whole lot of running behind the winner of this race. There were some big gaps back to horses who got very low speed figures. But this horse, Ghazali, ran a sneaky good race, and he seems like one that's bred to run all day. So I would look for him in the future.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's got one of the more interesting pace figure lines that you'll ever see. The first quarter mile, he was only just over a length behind. He had a 106 pace figure, and then he just completely fell off the map. He was a 69 after a half mile, and then he rallied back to a 91 final time speed figure. So it's not something you see often, but obviously something went amiss, or he lost focus or something, but he was certainly running on at the end. And the one thing I do want to mention about the speed figure is, even though there wasn't much to go on in here because there were a lot of first-time starters, this race was sandwiched in between Performer and Pacific Gale. It was quite a bit slower than Pacific Gale, so it really wasn't a tough speed figure to make. Those were the 3 one-turn races, and unless you think something crazy happened to the track in between and then it went back to the other way, those other 2 races just fit together like a glove. So I didn't see any reason not to rate this race as I did.
Now, we basically saw the filly version of Prevalence on Sunday as Slumber Party, a first-time starter for Kelly Breen, won a 7-furlong race, again, by a large margin on the front end. And this first-time starter, I thought she was equally impressive to the colt that we saw on Saturday.
Yeah, this was a really nice effort from her. I don't have the speed figure for this one. After a long Saturday, I shipped this one off to my assistant out in California. But my guess is it's going to be above the 100 mark. I have it at probably about 104. She did it as easily as could be, taking that early lead and just drawing away. I think the margin got bigger as every call throughout the race. And yeah, it's just a really impressive effort and actually faster than what we saw from Prevalence.
Yeah, I thought Joel Rosario gave this filly a very enterprising ride. He's not always the most aggressive jockey in the early stages, but I had to look down and check that it wasn't Paco Lopez halfway through the race because he was getting after this filly on the far turn to open up on the field and really come into the stretch with a big advantage, and he was able to accomplish that, and everybody else was off the bridle by the time they got to the quarter pole and basically out of the race, so she could just cruise into the wire. But this looks like a nice horse. Again, she's one where I question how far she wants to go because it is a bit more sprint pedigree on the dam side, but she's a daughter of Malibu Moon, so we'll see. Now let's move on to those other venues that I mentioned at the top of the show. Oaklawn Park on Friday, that was the opening day of their meet. They ran the Smarty Jones, the first in their series of Kentucky Derby prep races. This was not the strongest field that we're going to see in a Derby prep in 2021. It looked like a two-horse race coming in, although probably more like a 1.5 horse race, as the big favorite, unsurprisingly, was Caddo River, and he delivered, winning off by over 10 lengths.
I think it surprised the morning line maker that he was a big favorite. Sorry, I couldn't resist there.
Unfortunately.
But yeah, it was a huge effort from him, won by over 10 lengths, got a 109 TimeformUS speed figure. And this is another one, frankly, when I sat down to do the figures, just based on the visual, I was expecting a bigger number because he won so easily. But it looks like just more of a case that he ran his race. Nobody else really showed up much or did any running. So good effort from him, but I'm going to have to see more from him against better competition because this looked like a paid workout.
Yeah, I like this horse. I've been impressed with him going all the way back to when he was second in his second start at Belmont last year in October behind the very highly touted at the time Speaker's Corner. He ran really well in that race. And he's won his last two by large margins at Churchill and now here at Oaklawn. But he really hasn't been facing the toughest fields in either of these last two starts. I've seen him get tested and respond to it well, but we're going to have to see him do it again against a stakes field in the future, going two turns. So there are some questions that still have to be answered by this horse, but I think he is pretty good. We just have to see him do it against some tougher competition. The runner-up here, Cowan, really was no match for the winner. And I do want to just briefly mention, I know that we thought that Springboard Mile was a very fast race at the time last year. You had it fast on your figures. I think everybody had it fast. Senor Buscador was the impressive winner of that race. We've now seen a pattern of horses coming back and running much slower out of that race. So whenever Senor Buscador runs back, I think that's just something to keep in mind, that maybe we should approach that speed figure with just a little bit of skepticism.
Yeah, it's certainly something that's crossed my mind, and I've went back and looked, and that race looks pretty ugly so far. The only thing I'll say is there were races before and after it at the same or similar distances, and those races aren't having those same issues. There wasn't any kind of timing problem or anything like that, so it's really hard to say the figure is wrong, and I just can't get a sense of why the horses aren't running back to it. It's something I'll certainly be monitoring, but for example, the horse who won the race right after him, I'm forgetting his name now, the Carl Broberg horse who had won 1 million races in a row.
Hunk of Burning Love?
Yeah, Hunk of Burning Love had, he came back and ran just fine, and his speed figure was based on the same day, the very next race, if memory serves. So I think it might be just one of them, these ones where they're 3-year-olds and they can be kind of erratic, and it wouldn't surprise me if some of these started running back to those numbers, and maybe they just start throwing clunkers for whatever reason, but it's certainly one that I want to keep an eye out.
Well, Craig, since you brought up Hunk of Burning Love, I'll let you take it right into the next race, the 5th season, where this horse actually put up a really game fight as he just barely lost a tight photo to Silver State. These two horses put on a real show on Saturday at Oaklawn.
Yeah, they did. They kind of ran away from the field, but I would have to say Silver State was clearly the best horse in here. I mean, Hunk of Burning Love was pretty much by himself up front. He wasn't going particularly fast. His pace figures were basically the same as the speed figure that he ran. Both of the top two got a 117, but And that's pretty much what Hunka Burning Love always runs. He's usually in that 117 to 120 range. But Silver State was able to just gobble him up anyway and caught him on the wire. He's definitely got some upside. He's done nothing wrong this year. And I'll be curious to see where that one shows up next for sure.
Yeah, I was expecting Silver State to draw off a little more impressively in this race. Obviously, Hunka Burning Love's a really game horse who loves to win races, and he's never going to give it up easily. But I think based on the 2 races that Silver State ran at the end of last year, you were looking for him to take a bit of a more pronounced step forward on a speed figure standpoint, and he didn't quite do that here. I'm still skeptical this horse wants to go much farther than a mile. The mile was this race, and he didn't finish it off that impressively, so we'll see. These 2 horses obviously put on an exciting show. I'm just not sure how much upward potential they really have from what they ran in this race.
And I will say, I think I didn't pay much attention to Sunday yet. I'll go back and look at that card a little closer, other than watching Hidden Scroll. But I would say the first 2 days, speed wasn't great. You kind of did want to be off the pace and coming on late. I know in the TimeformUS Pace Projector, we had several races coded with fast paces, and it seemed like in almost every one of them, the horse with the best late pace rating was coming up to get the win. And there were a few others that didn't even have that flag where the best late pace rating was able to win the race. So that's not unusual for Oaklawn when the meet starts early in the season. The track seems to be a little deeper, and speed horses don't quite do as well as they will, say, when we get into March.
Well, then maybe we should upgrade the performances of the next 2 horses we're going to talk about, because we had a couple of 3-year-olds that were on the edge and that did well on Saturday, and certainly ran some speed figures that are noteworthy. The first of those was Swift Shore, who won an allowance race in his second career start. This Steve Asmussen runner is now 2 for 2 in his career, and I really liked the way he finished this race, because you had a horse, a long shot that ran off in the early going on the front end, and he let that one go, took over in the stretch, and kicked away pretty nicely in the late stages.
Yeah, I was impressed by this one. He had run a 102 first time out. He did it going wire to wire. And even though he just sat second, I was more impressed this time because he was able to sit off that leader, and he wasn't just right off his flank. He was a good 3 lengths behind him early and just put that horse away and drew off to win with a 111. And if you look at the chart, there are some other horses coming from back a little further that finished up. The leader was nowhere to be found. And I just thought it was a good effort, and surprise, surprise, Steve Asmussen seems to have himself another pretty good 3-year-old sprinter.
Yeah, this one reminds me a lot of Echo Town, who we saw in some of these same races last year, and obviously he went on to win a Grade 1 later in the summer for Steve Asmussen. We'll see if the same thing can be done by Swift Shore, but this is certainly the way you want to see a horse start off his career. The other sprint winner on Saturday that I think is worth mentioning was the winner of the last race on the card. That was Windmill, a Fox Hill Farm, Larry Jones' first-time starter. This filly was sent out to the lead from the rail, set an honest pace, and just drew away in the stretch.
Yeah, this was impressive from a guy that's not really known for having him cranked up to win first time out. This one certainly was. She bust out of the gate, established that clear lead, as you said, with a 124 pace figure, and just rode it all the way to the wire pretty easily. She got a 105 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, and I'll be really curious to see where this one shows up next, because seems surprising. It's not like she got bet down or anything and just kind of came out of nowhere, but a really big effort from her. Being out of Street Sense by a Grand Slam mare, I assume she should have some distance breeding, and that's kind of what Larry Jones usually does with his fillies. They wind up going longer in the 3-year-old filly stakes, so I'll be interested to see where she shows up, and I don't think this was a fluke. I think she's a really good filly.
Yeah, I was impressed by this performance for all the reasons you said. The fact that she wasn't bet and the way that she was just on the edge in every step of the way and kept finding more in the stretch. She is bred to stretch out. I mean, she's got that street sense, and the dam is a half-sister to Tara's Tango, who won the Grade 1 Santa Margarita or Santa Maria, one of those two, going 1 1/8 on the dirt when she was an older horse. So we'll see where this one goes if they do stretch her out immediately. But she certainly looks like one with potential. Move on to Santa Anita, where they ran one graded stakes last weekend. That was the Grade 3 Palos Verdes, going 6 furlongs on Saturday. And Wildman Jack, who we know best as a pretty talented turf sprinter, he went back to dirt here, and I won't be surprised if they keep him on dirt for a while after this performance, because this was impressive.
Yeah, I know we didn't cover this race on the forecast, but you'll have to pardon me. I'm going to do a little red boarding here because I've been waiting for this horse to get back on dirt. His one effort where he had run on dirt was huge, in my opinion, in that Bing Crosby. He was up on a really fast pace that just kind of completely fell apart. And he was the only one. He got beaten a length and a half, and then they put him back on turf. And this just wasn't a very strong field. And to me, it looked like if he ran that race from Del Mar, he was going to win. And he did. And when you watch the race, it was pretty obvious on the backstretch he was going to win. I mean, the rider was just sitting chilly. He was dueling with, I think it was long shot Captain Scotty, who's always up front. And he just put that one away and the race was over. And basically, he matched his speed figure. He got a 121 Timeform US, which matched what he had run at Del Mar. And it was just much too good for the rest of this very weak grade 3.
No, I remember we talked about that Bing Crosby at the time, the prior dirt race that Wildman Jack contested last summer. That Calumet horse that won was getting all the Collusion Illusion was also in there, and there was that Calumet horse Lexitonian, I think that was second. Those two horses were getting all the accolades for coming from way back, but the pace was so fast, and Wildman Jack contested it at 4 wide the entire way. I mean, he was the horse that ran the best race in there, and he finally got back on dirt here, as you said, and delivered. And we've talked about it before. This California turf division was just not that strong all throughout last year. CZ Rocket and Flagstaff, who were dominating that division, they were struggling to break the 120 speed figure barrier for most of the year. So I think in addition to that division, like Wildman Jack is pretty welcome.
Yeah, this was one of that Crosby race. You said he ran the best race that day. He got the best speed figure despite finishing 4th. Him and Law Abiding Citizen, who was also part of that duel. And as you mentioned, the top two, Collusion Illusion and Lexitonian, they just haven't done a thing since then. And while this horse has come back to win. And I'm with you. I hope they keep him on dirt because he just looks much better there than he does on turf. I mean, he's okay on turf, but there are much better races, much better purses on the dirt, and it seems to be his best surface.
Now, I didn't see the speed figure for this race that we're going to talk about from Sunday, so I don't know if it came back that fast. That's the Clocker's Corner going 6 furlongs on the turf course, this restricted stakes race. It was won impressively from a visual standpoint by Gregorian Chant, who closed from last place for Phil D'Amato. I just didn't see the speed figure, so I'm not sure if this is one that's even really worth talking about.
Yeah, it came back pretty decent. I think it's one my assistant does. I'll get it later today. But I'm guessing it's going to be about a 115 or so speed figure. And it's not often you see horses cut back from 1.5 miles to a turf sprint. But we did have this one tabbed as our top TimeformUS power pick. He got the job done at 10-1. You're not going to see a lot of Phil D'Amato horses go off 10-1 in these turf stakes, except when he has like 3 of them in there. And one of them gets overlooked. So I thought it was a good effort from him. I did want to talk a little bit about these turf sprints that we're getting at Santa Anita, and for the most part, they've been timed well. We weren't getting that when it was 5.5 and the run-up was really short, but there is an issue with these. They're listing the run-up for these 6 furlong races as 45 feet and the 6.5 furlongs as, I want to say 30 feet. But I can tell you the run-up at these 6 furlong races is way longer than 45 feet. It's well over 100 feet. So for that reason, there is no way you can make speed figures. Like I think on this card, there was maybe another 6.5 furlong race on the turf, and you just can't rate them together because they're impossible to compare. So it's basically going to be rated in isolation. Someday, if they actually tell us what the real run-ups are correctly, we could make those kind of adjustments. But now it's just kind of a guessing game. And as a speed figure guy, it's really frustrating. It's something I'm always working behind the scenes to get right. And Equibase is trying to get it right too. It kind of falls back on the racetracks to give us the right information. And I just want to put that out there for people who, when they look at the times of these races, the 6 furlong race just looks like it's miles faster than the 6.5. But when you're sprinting on turf and horses are just busting out of the gate trying to get position, the huge difference in run-ups is going to affect speed figures immensely.
Craig, that's good information, and I have to say I don't envy you. It seems like even when we fix these problems, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Yeah, the more I learn, the more I wish I had found a different career. No, just kidding. I enjoy what I do, but it can definitely be challenging at times. It's not as easy as some people make you believe when you just look at final times and think things are cut and dry.
Before we move away from Santa Anita onto our final venue, just one more race to talk about from last weekend out in California. That was a maiden special weight that took place early in the day on their Saturday card. And this one was won by another Doug O'Neill trained horse, the Great One, who was making, I believe, the fourth start of his career. So he came in with a real experience edge. And he also had a real edge by the time they got to the finish line, because this horse crossed the wire 14 lengths ahead of the rest of the field. There were only three rivals, but they were really strung out across the wire behind him.
Yeah, I mean, we got to keep in mind this horse was a nose from being a Grade 2 winner when he was narrowly beaten by Spielberg back in that Los Al Futurity. So he certainly had every right to win. It was kind of amazing. He went off 8-5 in here to me. I think a Bob Baffert first-time starter wound up going off favored and didn't really run a step at all. And the Great One did what he was supposed to do. He actually improved his speed figure. He got a 113 for this effort. So big number for him. The one caveat I would have is that it was only a 4-horse field. I tend to, not that I think there's anything wrong with the speed figure, but it's just easier to run a big number when you don't have to deal with any traffic or much stress in the race. So I'll be a little skeptical of this one until I see him do it. But he had obviously run well in that Los Al Futurity. So I assume he's one that we're going to see in a stakes race in California on the Derby Trail next time out. And we'll just see who else shows up. But his speed figure is going to put him in the mix.
Yeah, and the other thing about this race is this Santa Anita dirt course is starting to almost have that feel of Aqueduct in the winter to me sometimes when it gets really deep and tiring. And I mean, when I was watching this race halfway through, and I know they were going quickly up front, but I was thinking to myself, how is anybody going to win this race by 14 lengths? Because they were all traveling pretty well. All 4 of them were in the race. And then just suddenly Fenway dropped off and he ended up losing by 30 lengths. Another horse basically got eased to the wire. I mean, some horses, when they start to tire on the Santa Anita course, they really get tired and they just completely drop away. And I think that contributed to the margin of victory for the Great One. But he still ran a very fast speed figure, so he definitely has a right to jump right back into stakes company for his next start.
Yeah, it's a good point you make about the surface. Somebody had asked me about that on Twitter today, and it's true. The slower these surfaces get, the tougher the speed figures get to make. And it's because of what you say. The margins tend to start expanding more than on a normal track. And the slower it gets, the more it gets exaggerated. So it can be tricky for sure, especially with these big margin victories.
Let's end this podcast with one of our favorite horses, Mr. Buff, who got back on track on Saturday at Aqueduct in the Jazzle Stakes, which she had also won last year, not facing New York breds, but facing that kind of listed stakes level competition that he is typically so dangerous against, especially in the winter at Aqueduct. I know there were some questions about Mr. Buff's form coming into this race, but the good Mr. Buff, when he shows up, he's just really hard to beat in these races.
Yeah, he definitely was back in form. He got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. Won really easily by 7. It was a slow track, so maybe that margin's exaggerated a little, but he beat some pretty decent horses in here. A Musical Heart, Backside of the Moon. I was a little surprised how heavily Tenderfoot was bet in this race. He really didn't stack up on speed figures, but he wound up running a good second, so Good, strong effort. The disappointment had to be Backside of the Moon, who was coming off that powerhouse performance last time. He didn't get out of the gate particularly well after last time firing out to the lead, and I was hoping he was going to use the same tactics here, but in the end, I don't think it mattered at all because he just didn't have much, and Mr. Buff was back.
Yeah, Backside of the Moon had ridden that track bias last time when he was on the rail the entire way to that big speed figure. I don't think we were expecting him to regress that much, even though I think some regression was expected. But he was just never himself in this race and really wasn't ever a factor. And I don't think it really would have mattered anyway because Mr. Buff was always going to be tough to beat in this race once he ran his race. I mean, you could see coming around the far turn that he was traveling in the bridle and was just ready to draw off whenever Kendrick Carmouche pushed the button. So I hope we stays in this kind of form, because I've kind of abandoned the idea that Mr. Buff's going to be a grade 1 winner later this year. I just think, he had his chances last year and it didn't work out, and his form kind of fell apart as they pursued that. But if they can keep him in these softer races, he's always going to be a terror for these horses.
Yeah, for sure. And I kind of hope they try graded stakes every now and then with him, just because he's an auto toss. For whatever reason, he's a complete enigma. He just runs different. He's kind of a bully, I guess. When he has competition he can beat, he usually does so. And when it gets a little tougher, he kind of disappears. But I am a fan. It's just he is one of the more perplexing horses we have in training. And as a gelding, I doubt he's going anywhere anytime soon when he can still run 122 TimeformUS speed figures.
Well, that's all the racing to recap for this week. Fun list of races to discuss, Craig. I think we've got a lot to look forward to this year, from Knicks Go down to the other stakes winners we saw, and even some of these maiden allowance winners. Just the sense that I got throughout this show is that there are a lot of horses that I'm looking forward to running back off their performances from this past weekend.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, especially the 3-year-olds, because now the older horses are going to shift probably to Saudi and Dubai, stuff I wish our horses would stay here. I understand why they don't, of course. If I owned a horse, I'm sure I'd want to go run for a ton of money, but it's a little bit disappointing. So we'll have to focus on the 3-year-olds for a while, because there's really not much for older horses coming up. But then again, this is the biggest time of the racing season if you think the Kentucky Derby is the best race we have, as most do. And I mean, I think it's our most important race. So the long build-up's starting, and it's really about the kick in the high stream starting this weekend with the Holy Bull.
Yeah, I imagine the 3-year-olds will be on our TimeformUS forecast agenda this week when we record that on Friday. The Holy Bull is being run, and also the Robert B. Lewis out at Santa Anita. Both are this Saturday. So we'll see how those fields come up, and if we can find some good ideas in there from a handicapping perspective, as well as some other stakes that we'll surely discuss on that Friday podcast. For now, guys, remember you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to stay tuned for that TimeformUS forecast this upcoming Friday.